Where do agencies get their jobs? Where do the bill rates oftentimes come from? What is a vendor? We're going to talk about this new slice of pie. And I say new, I'm talking about the last 20 years, maybe slightly less, maybe 15 to 20 years. There's been a new slice of the pie that was carved out. Doesn't go to you guys, doesn't go to the agency, doesn't go to Uncle Sam. We're going to talk about vendors on this week's edition of Travel Evolved. It's Travel Evolved. Welcome to the episode, everybody. I am Mark Holloway, your host. Got a big one for today. We're talking about vendors. It's a tough one. It's a tough one for me to talk about. And we'll hear why as the episode continues and as I go into this episode. But I'm kind of excited about this one because this is an area that most travelers are incredibly unfamiliar with, and I think it's going to be really helpful. This kind of goes along those lines I always talk about, of where we kind of start to explain a little bit of our side of this, which I do think helps you. This is not to justify anything. I just think you guys need to know this because it allows you a fuller picture of the travel cycle, which I do believe is going to be very, very helpful for you to understand how bill rates and pay rates are distinguished, who's getting parts of the pie. I know I talked about the pie and I talked about vendors previously, but we're going to delve into it deeply today because it's a good conversation. And one I think, again, this is a must listen to on Travel Evolve. So as always, thank you guys immensely for your subscriptions. Thank you for sharing this, by the way. I've been noticing that our subscription rates are going up. We're not doing an awful lot of advertising for Travel Evolved, except for I think on TikTok. There's some stuff that's going on there. It's kind of hard to do TikTok because we're really trying to promote next gen MedStat, but they're also throwing in some things on this, so it's a little weird to me. But I trust the youngins that know how this stuff works in social media. And the good thing is they're not asking me to do a bunch of stuff above and beyond what I've already done, so they're taking some things apart on these episodes, which is kind of cool. So thank you guys for sharing the news and kind of sharing this Travel Evolved with some of your fellow travelers. It's where we're going to grow, and it's what really rewards us. If I saw the numbers tapering off, or even actually worse, going down, we'd probably stop doing it because it would tell me that we're clearly not hitting an audience. The fact that we're just continually rising consistently over time, I think it really kind of goes to show that I think this is something you guys are looking for. And I've always said this is not the epitome of your traveling healthcare education. What we're always offering you guys is a different side, a different scope of things that I don't believe you're truly going to get, honestly, in a transparent way anywhere else. So still obviously down here in beautiful sunny Florida. Matter of fact, good thing those bamboo trees are kind of hiding some of this because it's going to hit me right in the eyes pretty soon. But we had to knock these out because we're going to be going out as a team tonight and hitting the lower southern Gulf Coast of Florida. It is a Friday when we're recording this, probably not a Friday when we're airing this, but we've really enjoyed our time here. I think we're going to probably have time to do one more episode before we head back to Colorado, and a couple people are heading further on back to LA. So we're going to try to knock out one more of these. I just love this environment. It's been a very, very productive, incredibly successful time spent here. So I've extended a little bit. So at any rate, it's just been fun. But tonight we're actually going to go out and reward ourselves a little bit. We're going to take the team out for a nice dinner because it may be the last weekend we're here, because I think that we're leaving on a Thursday, so a little less than a week, about 6 days some of the flights are scheduled. So some of the teams will be heading out there, and I think I'm one of them because I got to get back, get some things ready for the next leg, which is going to be 60 days later, heading out to California. So enough about our personal trip and traveling stuff, but anyway, I just wanted to knock this out before I met everybody out, so I'm going to try to do it as effectively as I can. The first thing I want to say about vendors is I challenge you to find anybody from our side of the industry who is willing to actually openly talk about vendors, because they don't want to. They're scared to say anything negative about them. And like all of us, vendors have their pros and their cons. This is not an episode to beat them up. This is not an episode for me to pat them on the back. It's part of the process. It's part of the pie. It's part of our world. And it's time we talked about it so you guys understood what it is that they do, some of the things that they help and assist with, some of the things that they actually hinder with. It's just an honest conversation that we have to have so you guys get it. So what surprises me, I shouldn't say it surprises me, I'm not surprised actually that nobody's willing to openly talk about vendors, because what is a vendor? Let's just kind of start off with that. A vendor there's two different types, but typically they are the ones that hold the contract, and in one way, shape, or form, they award them to a huge number of us agencies, whether they are staffing the contract themselves in addition, or they're simply a liaison between a hospital and a whole bunch of agencies that are going to compete for the jobs that those hospitals have. One way, shape, or the other, that's what they do, and that's how they are. So that is a relatively new wrinkle. I'll talk about the history of them here in a little bit, but because they control who has the contracts is why so many agencies are deathly afraid to say anything bad about them. And there is bad. Listen, it's not like anything else. You can say you're good and bad about an agency, because there are absolutely bad parts about having to work through a travel staffing company to find employment. Oh, I'm hooked up to the hut there. So I'm like, why is my phone so loud? I'll just turn that off. I must hit that with my knee and my Bluetooth. Sorry. We were jamming to some music earlier and you get it. So anyway, that's why people don't want to openly talk about it, because they just would say, oh, they're great, they do these wonderful things. Well, they do, but it's part of the process. It is the fourth slice of the pie. When we talk about the pie, and the pie being the bill rate, I've always said, the first slice that I always usually discuss is in fact that vendor fee, and it's usually about 5% of the bill rate. That's what these companies, I should say, and agencies get paid to basically have and hold the contract that they farm out to all of us, whether they're staffing themselves, and there's a lot of vendors who are their own agency. And there's vendors who don't do any staffing, and they don't do any recruiting, and they simply just take that 5% off of every hour that you work, and that we bill a hospital as their fee for being able to do the things that they do, and which we're going to talk about pretty openly. So because they control the money and the reward for who gets to play with that system or with that hospital, most agencies are afraid to say anything about the process that makes it bad, makes it tough. And I'm not, because I think that any vendor that listens to me and listens to it openly would say, he's kind of right, because that is part of what we do well, and there are some things that we don't do as well. So it's tough for them to have an honest conversation, and nothing like that is tough for me. I've always said nothing's off limits, so if I'm going to say nothing's off limits, that has to include vendors too. I can't be saying most things are off limits, but I'm not going to talk about the ones that basically pay our bills, which is what a vendor kind of does. Sorry, a bunch of racing around here on a Friday night going on with motorcycles and drag racing on the other side of the bay here. So here's the fact. Most agencies, I should say, are pretty willing to talk about the pros in which and how vendors have made things simpler and easier and a little more streamlined for hospitals and for you to go to work for us or through us at that particular facility. The fear obviously comes from them talking about what it does that actually deters from that process. So here's what I'll say. Vendors are part of the system. They are part of our industry. They are here to stay for now. I will admit to you guys, even sometimes I always say, well, I was right about this, I was right about that. And I do like to pat myself on the back, because I like to prognosticate on some things. And on occasion, I'm right about them. Here was one that I was absolutely 100% incorrect about. When vendors first came into the picture, I mean, again, I'll go into the history, but they were not part of the process when I first got in this industry. There was no such thing as a vendor. You just worked directly with the hospital, and the hospitals worked directly with however many agencies they wanted to work with, and they had a staffing coordinator or someone in HR or someone in the unit that would promote tell us what their jobs were and what the bill rates were going to be for those. When vendors came into the picture, I was on record, and I wasn't doing any social media back then, but I remember saying very specifically that I was 100% convinced that they wouldn't last, that the industry would not be able to handle the bill rate that's in the that's part of that process. So that's not in there. In other words, what I'm saying is that I felt that the bill rates couldn't handle another piece of the pie being pushed out, if that makes sense. And I said, there's no way. I mean, even by the way, this is back when they were at 2%. 2% of the bill rate. I thought, and this is back in the early 90s. I said, that's a lot. It's a lot of money, and it is now money that agencies are not able to use to dangle carrots and to put on compensation for travelers, so it's going to hurt. And I was wrong. I was absolutely wrong about that. The bill rates went up to encompass those rates. Hospitals typically were unaware of why the rates were increasing, because hospitals don't really get how the vendor works. I think most hospitals don't really think about the dollars that are being spent through them, which is a wonderful thing for the vendors. They don't want them to think about that because it does cost fulfillment for sure. But I was absolutely 100% incorrect when I said that I felt that the vendor fee would be something that would paralyze the industry to a point that it wouldn't sustain itself. And I couldn't have been more wrong. And I know, I can see now what happened. And like I said, it was just that as the vendor percentages increased, those rates increased, it changed so subtly that hospitals didn't really recognize what it was that was changing. I think they just felt that the rates were going up and not that more and more was needed to be spent in order to carve out a higher and higher piece of the pie for those vendors. So they're part of the industry right now, and we'll talk a little bit down the road if I think they're going to be here forever. I was wrong about how long they were going to be here, so I guess I'll see if I can be wrong on whether or not I think they're going to stay. But they're here for right now. They are solidified heavily into our system, and every time theoretically that you guys take a contract, there are two entities that are being paid. And if you want to say three, Uncle Sam, but besides the government on your taxes, there are two entities typically that are being compensated out of that bill rate before it gets to you, and that is the travel agency and oftentimes the vendor. If the vendor has a direct contract, if the agency has a direct contract themselves, then that piece of pie is obviously eliminated, but that really happens only with the big companies. And we also know with those big companies, they tend to have the biggest margins, which means there's not a lot of difference in what you guys see left over. What typically goes to a vendor, if it's a direct bill with one of the big companies, just gets encapsulated into their margin, and the pay rate seems to stay the same, if actually not even decrease a little bit. So it's going to be interesting to see how things go. But I have a couple theories that I hope to get to on this episode. So here's what I want to start off with. Like I said, when I got in this industry 23 and a half years ago, I feel like when you're a kid and you want to be like, I'm 10 and a half. Because I know I keep telling you how long I've been in this industry, and I've gone back, and some of the things I saw on TikTok said, we've been doing this for 21 years. I'm like, well, not anymore. It's definitely increased, pretty substantially since then. So it's interesting to watch that happen. So in November, that's when it has been 23 years. So it is now March of 2023. So it has been 23 years. When I got in this industry, no vendors. Like I said, what would happen is our account managers would pick up the phone and they would start calling hospitals and hospital systems, and they would say, hey, we really want to work with you. We've got X amount of travelers in California that, let's say in the Bay Area, that are interested in coming to work. We can fulfill. Would you let us become part of your, basically what was an emailing list, which was how hospitals communicated with us. Every so often, few days, maybe once a week, we'd get a list of the open needs through an email. And you could actually see on it, before people were smart enough to realize how to blind CC, but you could actually see on those emails exactly how many vendors, how many agencies were on that list. And it just kept getting bigger and bigger. But those hospitals would communicate directly with us let's say I'm going back to those rates. We had a $70, bill rate in the ICU here in the Bay Area of California. Yes, that was a real figure back then. And we need 10 travelers in our ICU for these two hospitals. So please start sending us your candidates. And we would email our profile packets and our profile packages of a traveler over with all their contact information, and the very small packets those used to be, which was used to be just a resume and a skills checklist, I think, wasn't all the stuff that's required now. And we would email them to the person that was the contact at the hospital. And again, hospitals were run differently. Sometimes it was a internal recruiter. We saw that where a recruiter would also kind of communicate and be the liaison for the positions. Oftentimes it would go into HR. The bigger hospitals had their own person. The really big hospitals had many people, like you had somebody in the ICU that was an ICU administrative, assistant type helper person, and you had the same kind of thing in the ED, and you had somebody else in the med surg departments that would communicate those directly. It's a Friday night. Speaking of EDs and communicating directly, so there was some wonderful things about those days. One of the things that I think I will talk about frequently on today's episode is that you started to really understand how the hospital ebbed and flowed. You got to know these people. They got to know you. They could literally say, Mark, we really need these 10 ICU nurses. And you could go to your recruiting team and say, hey, guys, this is my good friend here, and I really need some help getting these things done. Can you guys, it's good rate. We talk about the rates, what we could offer. And, the recruiting team would oftentimes, I could hear them. They'd be making some calls because they had successes there. They knew a good facility and a good location. So they were pretty open and willing to work hard for those facilities that rewarded our travelers with a good work environment and a good high pay rate. So it was a really nice, in my opinion, good ebb and flow back in those days. I missed that part of it immensely. I have to talk about the other side of the coin, and I do think that back then the efficiency of what that would look like was very, very old school, kind of like what we're doing with our app and that sort of thing. And we had to recognize, and I think a lot of people did, that communicating to that many different agencies and having that many different, it's one thing to communicate one way, but of course every one of those agencies was communicating back, maybe asking questions, maybe, following up, are you interested in my candidate? If they interview and, they're going to make her an offer. And there was a lot of two-way communication, which I'm sure really bogged those folks down, which doesn't exist now with a vendor in the middle of it. So that was difficult. I think that the speed in which they would release their jobs was slower. So it was email. You would email, and then the email would communicate with the person that was receiving, your typical account manager. And that account manager can only handle so many different accounts. So you had to have more account managers, so to speak, to be able to handle just the volume of correspondence, if that makes sense. So it was a lot of work, and there was definitely, because of how things worked back then, there was a lot of delay in communication. Everything was done by email, and you just kind of had to be aware. And I mean, it's been so long that I don't really remember how we would communicate that to our recruiting team. If we had I wouldn't be surprised if we literally were working off Excel spreadsheets back then. Most had some type of software, whether it was a Salesforce type ACT, those kind of things that would kind of organize all your candidates. I believe that's what I used to have. A lot of our companies would work off of, because it was kind of a pre-made thing where you could keep everyone organized and give you the reminders you needed to do. But it was kind of a very archaic way of communicating, much like I believe recruiters are archaic now. I mean, we're just speeding up, and becoming more and more efficient. This was one of those areas that I believe that a vendor really enhanced, these vendors really enhanced the industry. Things moved faster. Things moved much, much quicker. You needed one person at your facility to, in a one-way fashion, communicate the needs, be able to show what the bill rates were going to be, throw those out there, and a vendor then would take them and communicate them through their website or through their platform, and say, here's the 10 jobs we got in from this facility, and all of us agencies that were associated with that vendor and had a contract with that vendor would then see them and jump through hoops to get it all done. So there was a lot of speed in which the communication aspect, I think, became much more effective and much more efficient. And that's what vendors basically said. All this communication that you're doing through all these facilities, what if we, and I guess I should have backed up and said this earlier, what if we created a website, or what if we had a website in our company that we could show not only this facility, but every facility. We can go out and grab all these different facilities and put them all in one place where we could then subcontract these out. We could take a fee, even if it's only like 1 or 2%, and it was back in those days, and we could make money and not have to be throwing out that crazy cash for payroll, and all we have to do is be the recipient of the money. And this sounds pretty good. And it was. I mean, what a remarkable idea, a great way to make money, and it was a phenomenal way to streamline the process. But I think you guys can understand that when I looked at, and by the way, it used to be 1-2%. The average now is 5 to 6%, which doesn't sound like a lot, but on a $100 bill, we're talking about $5 an hour. We'll talk about some numbers here in a little bit. When I saw those numbers start to escalate, that's when I said, "There's no way. There's no way that hospitals are going to continue to be able to pay this." But what happened was, as the rates went from 70 to 80 to 85, and the margins went from 2 to 3 to 5%, I don't think hospitals really understood what was creating the lack of fulfillment. They were just saying, hey, the bill rates are going up. These darn travelers are requiring more and more money, which is true. I mean, just simple cost of living and having things get more and more expensive every year was one thing, but they also didn't kind of see, and I don't believe hospitals to this day really understand, that on a $100 bill rate, if there is a 5% fee, that really what an agency is working with is only $95, which again doesn't sound like a lot of money, but hospitals don't think about it. There's $5 in this example every hour for every single employee that's on a $100 bill rate that we have working at our facility that's not going to that agency that staffed it. It's not going to that traveler who's working it, more importantly. It's going to a third party for basically holding the contract and communicating it. And I'm downplaying what they do immensely, but that's kind of the overall gist of it. And I think that's how hospitals started realizing that, or just, I guess I shouldn't say started realizing, were lack of realizing why the rates were eking up slowly. It probably made sense that they were going up. I don't know if they really knew or were informed that it was also going up because the vendor fees were increasing, relatively largely. And along with those vendor fees, I will justify and say more and more responsibility was being conducted and provided for by the vendor. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. So pretty clever of them to say, we can manage this for you. And here's what I would imagine the conversation went. Hey, if we could have you not have to have your person communicate with all these knucklehead agencies and all that work, and you could actually even not have to have a person that you're paying to do all this work inefficiently, if we could take that over for you and literally now have you work with 3 to 4 times the number of agencies, which is going to guarantee your fulfillment, and you wouldn't see 1 penny difference in the bill rates that you were paying, would that be something of interest to you? I'm sure the answer was absolutely, and that's exactly what they did. So they said, okay, we're taking let's say it was only $50 an hour, and we're only going to charge an agency $2.50 for our 5% fee, which means they're still going to get it. It just means that the agency now was able to play with about $2.50 less money, which if you figure tax and everything else, probably meant about a $2 an hour difference in what they were previously being able to offer a traveler to now what they were going to be able to offer one without. However, the positive side of having this vendor was, for the hospital was probably a larger increase, I would imagine, in fulfillment. You guys may not like what I just said because you now probably realize that this swing in business model started costing travelers money, and it did, because initially it would be a difference in what the travelers were being paid. What I was getting at a few seconds ago was that I said the bill rates would increase because if the fulfillment wasn't getting met, the hospitals would assume, well, it's because the rates are too low, so we're going to go up a couple bucks. And really what they've just done is they've gone up those couple of bucks to compensate for the pay of the vendor. So now that the traveler was making the same kind of money as they were, and the vendor had their piece of pie, and the hospital was the one that actually foot the bill for the additional $2.50 that we were required for them to get back into a supply and demand and a demographic that gave the ability for us to pay properly, I'm sure eventually came out of the hospital's pocket. So it all evens out. But it's interesting to me that I would bet you that if you sat down with some very smart men and women at facilities that understood travel healthcare and how they're billed and paid, many would not realize that the fee that they're paying is coming out of the traveler's pocket in a roundabout kind of way. Not even a roundabout way. The way I describe things is kind of a direct way. I bet the very, very intelligent men and women that are CFOs of facilities and that handle these decisions probably never really once thought about, so if I've got $100 bill rate and I'm paying a vendor, or the vendor's getting 5%, that's really a $95 bill. So I'm really, they would probably rethink this, but I guarantee those conversations are openly being had by vendors to hospitals, because the message probably is, this doesn't cost you a cent. And theoretically, they're not kidding. It doesn't really cost them a cent, but it does cost them fulfillment. It lowers the ability for fulfillment. So there you go. That's the pro and con of both sides. Incredibly brilliant. And the first few companies that started doing this were way ahead of the game. And as you guys know, I believe in advancement. I believe in things that should help. I think this did help. I think overwhelmingly where I was wrong was, I think I missed the little fact that the hospitals wouldn't really notice, that they would just absorb that rate. That was one thing I missed. The other thing I missed is, I think that there has been things now, as I'll talk about here, that vendors now do to add to the placement, booking, credentialing, and fulfillment process that they weren't doing back when I probably was thinking that they wouldn't last. And so there's some things that they do. We'll talk about here as we go. So what happened instantly when this started happening is, you instantly were no longer allowed to talk to your hospital directly. If you had a contract, or if you gained a contract through a vendor, or one that was lost and moved to a vendor, you instantly are no longer allowed to communicate direct to the hospital. That's one thing you guys should recognize. If the average, 95% of agencies out there that do work through vendors, most of us do, we are not allowed to communicate directly with the hospital anymore, because the vendor's afraid that they want to be in control of the conversation. They don't want an agency to steal or to say anything that's not showing the best light of the vendor. So they kind of forbid that. Matter of fact, it's a penalty, and you can get kicked out of the entire system if you talk to and work directly with a hospital kind of around a vendor's back. None of us do it because it's a no-no. So that instant communication piece that I talked so heavily of early on here tonight, all of a sudden was gone. You no longer have great direct communication with your facility, which I kind of felt is a little bit of a bummer. It's like, we just lost what I felt was one of the biggest parts of what made each agency a nuance and good. It really separated a lot of agencies from ones that were good from ones that weren't good. Now we were all on a level playing field, and the hospital couldn't really see or tell or get to know us and what we were doing. And we'll talk more about timekeeping issues and billing and everything else and payroll. A lot of this stuff started to exacerbate the lack of communication, because we weren't allowed, and still to this day are not allowed, to communicate. We have to go through somebody else who may or may not have a vested interest in getting the question or the problem solved very quickly. So it becomes a bit of an issue. But the flow was instantly changed to now, instead of going like this, now it was going here to there and back here. And for me, it marked a change in the industry that was both positive and negative. And I will admit that I first saw it, and still kind of do, as a negative aspect, because it allowed substandard agencies to come in and just be incognito and just be throwing bodies at a submission and at an opening. I've got 20 ER nurses, I'll throw them at this job, and it doesn't really matter because it's all about volume anymore. And it really was, and all about getting the higher quality candidate. You weren't able to sell your candidate to a facility. You weren't able to explain to somebody, hey, I know this person only has a couple years experience, but look at them, they've worked in the Bay Area, or they're California licensed, they've got this sort of thing. It was just, here it is. And I missed that part of it. I think that part of it definitely hurts a good agency's ability to effectively recruit a candidate. Now it's all about numbers. It's all about whatever, and that's why we're taking it a next step further, because it really is now about not selling you guys, and it's a numbers thing. And I see it and get rewarded and validated almost every day based upon what we're doing now currently. So another advancement. And again, there's pros and cons to everything. And I think we're in another one of those states of flux like we were 15 years ago with vendors. I believe we're in that period of time again right now. So I guess what I'm saying is that we no longer can communicate. Now that goes to everything. There is now a slice of pie that's been added. The bill rates are increased, but now literally we are at the mercy of a third party to sell you. And that's still the case to this day. So you guys have to understand, I get this all the time, especially with the Recruiterless app. People are like, what have you heard from the hospital? Well, I want to say to these people that say that, we never hear anything. We never did. We certainly don't now. It's very rare where hospitals say, hey, we really like Sally Smith. However, she's not, right what we're looking for, so we're going to move on from her. They just don't tell you that. They just don't interview you. And travelers are oftentimes still looking for that, some sort of feedback is what they say. What's the feedback? I haven't heard anything. What have you heard? We don't. We hear, we want your candidate, or we hear the job's been filled by another candidate, or it's closed. That's the point of communication between us and hospitals anymore. It's almost down to nothing, which is why I believe a Recruiterless app really makes sense, because what's the point? Recruiter can sell you, but the communication after you, to us, to them, doesn't exist. So let's get rid of the communication entirely. Let's turn it into a complete numbers game, because that's really what it's become now. It's not, let's get rid of the sales aspect, because the sales aspect on this side is gone. So why are we bothering selling travelers on how great we are as a company and how great this job is? You guys need to start treating things very similarly to the way the hospitals are, and that it is a numbers game for you as well. And that's why the Recruiterless app just makes all kinds of sense. And other avenues too, not just what we're doing, but other things that are automating the process, I believe are really changing the industry for the better. But you guys got to jump on board with it, because you'll see how much more effective and efficient you are. So there's my plug kind of for the day. So here's kind of how everything, I kind of want to walk you through how things kind of work. The way that this works is, again, all of us vendors sign up or are awarded a contract with a vendor. And I'm going to talk about the difference between an MSP and a VMS here in just a little bit. But it is part of that. The game is that you want to get involved and you want to be awarded, hey, I'm going to play with XYZ vendor, and they say, yes, we're going to let you be in our loop, we're going to give you access to our jobs, and we're going to allow you to bid on them, and we're going to allow you to actually place at the facilities we work with. Now, what vendors are doing currently is they are kind of weeding out new companies, weeding out companies that don't have a lot of experience in the industry. They're looking to make sure that they are getting the most bang for their buck. Kind of like hospitals used to do back in the day. They didn't just sign contracts with everybody. They had enough and they were getting their needs met. It was hard to get into them. So what vendors have realized is, and again, I can tell you this from being a brand new company 3 years ago, had it not been for a lot of the people that worked at Next Gen MedStaff and people that knew who we were individually, we wouldn't have gotten a lot of these contracts. But because we've been in the industry for as long as we have, and people know what we're capable of, getting individually, either as account managers or higher ups in our company, we were given contracts that I think most brand new companies would really have struggled with. For a lot of times it was just a phone call. Hey, it's me. So here's what we're doing. Here's what we want to do. Can we play? Yeah, we can, because we've proven in the past that you have the ability to play. I really envy, or I don't envy new companies trying to jump in to do the exact same thing nowadays, because I can't imagine that's going to be easy for them to be able to just jump in and get access to jobs that everybody wants to have. It's definitely more difficult. So I guess I'm going to look at my notes here, because I want to make sure I'm saying this right. But the vendors are they charge fees to the agencies, but there's really not a lot of discussion about the fulfillment of to the hospitals. It's more, if they're not getting their needs met fulfillment wise, they're going to open it up to more of the agencies, and I'll talk about tiering as well down the road. But that's what they're typically looking. If they have a hospital that's typically killing it, and they've got 50 of us agencies that are working through that system, they're getting enough profiles and enough submissions that the managers at that facility are able to make good decisions, and their needs are met, they're not getting complained about, then they're not going to open that system or that hospital up to another person. There's no need. But they will say, hey, we've got this hospital in the middle of nowhere that nobody wants to recruit for. If you can get us that, then we'll let you have that hospital, and then you can kind of prove yourself, XYZ agency, and start to build yourself into more and more more and more opportunities if you show us you can hit these other areas. It's clever. It's a little unfair, but it's the way it is. I mean, why would they add more people to hospitals that are getting their needs fulfilled with their number of submissions they're getting? It doesn't make a lot of sense. So, it's just part of how the whole thing works. So, bottom line was, back 15 years ago, there was another slice of the pie that was created. It's moved up to about 5%. So let's talk about some numbers here briefly. Just want to check my time, make sure I'm okay, and I'm doing really good here. Let's talk about the 5% fee, because that is predominantly the most common currently. I have seen 7. I think it's insane. I think some agencies were flirting with the idea. They've gone up. I will say this. I will say that some vendors, one comes to mind, they're at a 5% fee, but they also take an additional 2% off if they pay within 30 days, which last time I checked, that's when most invoices are due anyway. So they're basically taking 7% for paying on time. So it's when I say there are other fees, that's part of it. But let's just talk some numbers. I mentioned I'm going to use some really easy numbers because I've done them here already, so I have to pull it out. But I want to go back to that $100 bill rate, because that's kind of what we're seeing currently right now. We are seeing some systems in where I am here in Florida, and maybe this, the southeastern seaboard. I am seeing some rates that are ridiculously low, and they're getting the fulfillment. So I always say don't shoot the messenger on those kinds of things. But I want to stick with a $100 bill rate and explain to you guys that on a $100 bill rate for a vendor that is charging a 5% fee, they're making $5 an hour every hour that each traveler is working. So if you look at that, it's $5 an hour, an average work week. Let's just say it's a 36. Let's not pretend it's a 40. Let's say it's only a 36-hour work week. If you take $5 an hour times 36 hours times 52 weeks in a year, you're talking about $9,360, which means a traveler that works on a $100 bill rate for a vendor that's charging 5% fee is worth over $9,000 for one employee annually. You take 1,000 of those people, which is pretty normal, you're talking about over $9 million in top-end revenue just for that 5% fee. 1,000 employees working for a system is probably not that challenging for those bigger vendors that have that. I mean, where these are realistic and legitimate numbers. That's $9 million for 1,000 travelers that a vendor is getting that those 1,000 travelers are not, if that makes sense to you guys. That's where it should sting you a little bit, because it does stink that's where it's kind of gone to. The hospitals typically are paying this. The agencies, us agencies, we're making the money that we want to make, because that figure is always carved out before we figure out our calculations. In other words, I don't calculate a low margin, and I already shared with you guys where I'm at. But let's go with a big company that's making a 30% margin. They're not doing 30% on 100. They're taking 30% of 95, which is a larger, bigger figure. We're not dumb enough to say, well, then we'll have to take the agency fee out afterwards. No, this is based upon the amount of money we're expecting to collect, and in this case, it's $95, not 100. So, it's a lot. It's a lot of money. This is not small dollars. And I'm sure there's some smaller mom and poppy type vendors out there that probably don't have 1,000, but you can understand that. I mean, literally, if you had 100, you're making close to $1 million a year, making $900,000 a year. That's not bad money, right? For just having that small amount. What's the overhead for that? A couple of IT people. So it's a wonderful business to get into. For those of you guys that are thinking about getting into an industry, think about getting into vendor management as opposed to going into an agency, because there's enough of us walking around there and you don't have to shell a penny. The worst part about owning an agency is that you actually have to pay travelers up front for 60 days, which becomes hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars quickly and turns into millions of dollars the bigger you get, because you're floating that payroll. There's no floating at all. And I'll explain how it works. The hospitals pay the vendors first. Here's your $100. The vendor says, great. They get it pretty quickly, I would imagine. They turn around and say, okay, in a little while, we're going to sit on this money for a few weeks. We're going to sit on this dollars for a few weeks. We're then going to pay the vendor, I'm sorry, I keep doing that, the agency $95 of what we got. We're going to keep the $5. So they've got their money, and they didn't have to pay anything up front on it. There's no cost of money. They're not spending their money except for on their internal employees and salaries and their progressions and their advancements on their IT and their website. So it is a really wonderful industry where it's just receiving of payments and receiving of dollars. I mean, I'll take that all day long. So you can kind of understand why it's one that I think most people are like, hey, I like to be part of that. All right, I want to talk real quickly about there's two different types of vendors. There's typically a VMS or a vendor management system. Now, these are the agencies or the companies that do not recruit themselves. They literally are contract holders, and they take their positions and they throw them out to different agencies and say, you work for us. They don't staff. They don't have a recruiting team. They're not interested in that. They were formed and created typically to just manage these different agencies, which is why they're a vendor management system. The MSPs, or the managed service providers. Remember, the word provider is really what tips you off here. These are some of the companies that also recruit, and what they do is that when they can't make fulfillment, whether they're just so darn big or just another thing, they've said, well, we'll do our best to recruit, but we're also going to subcontract this out and allow other people to play. So we are a managed service provider, which means we're a recruiting company, we're an agency ourselves, but we're also going to subcontract these out. So it's kind of interesting because, I mean, we all play with both. I personally like VMSs better because a couple of reasons. One of them is the jobs are given to us instantly. If you can understand, with a managed service provider, they're going to try their darndest oftentimes to get fulfillment on their own first. And if they fail, they're worried about the facility saying, hey, come on, what's going on? Then they'll go ahead and subcontract it out. I've seen that before, where they're basically delaying the job, giving their internal team a crack at it first, which definitely means that by the time a standalone agency sees that job, it could have already been out there for a week, which means there already could be people in front of it from that internal company's own submissions. So a lot of you guys are competing with somebody that's already been in front of that manager for a while. It depends upon how good he or she is on the interviewing process. Also, what they do is, again, they will oftentimes say, we're getting our fee of 5%, but I have seen, and believe it or not, they can call this ethical or not, but I've seen them say it's $90 to you guys, which means not only are we going to take, they're not saying it's $100 and we're taking 5%. They're saying it's $90 and they'll take the 5%. They're oftentimes used to be, maybe that's not the case now, but I know oftentimes back a while ago, they weren't always honest about what the rate was. In other words, you could say, well, is that what you guys are billing? Well, that's not, we don't know. We'd find out later that their rates were higher. So not only were they charging us a 5% fee, but they were also lowering the opportunity. So they were double, triple dipping, so to speak, which means that it was really challenging. By the time our people would get there, if we were able to convince and sell them, they were definitely, they weren't being paid as much as they should have been if we would have been playing on a level playing field. Here's what's kind of interesting, and I'm going to try to explain this because it's really wild. For some of the big companies, and follow me if you can on this one, and I know it's hard to do on a podcast and a YouTube channel, but for some of these big companies, their margin is so high, 30+% these days. Think about this. If they are in fact billing a $100 bill rate, that means that they are working off of a $70 bill rate between you and Uncle Sam, a pay rate, should say, pay package that's going to go to you and Uncle Sam. $70 already went down that low. For a company that's working off a 20% margin, let's just say they only give them, and I'll try to do the math here. If they're only giving them, let's just say let's just do it straightforward. I'll try to see if I can do the math here quick enough live. I'm going to do it on my phone because I didn't bring my calculator out here with me. I should have. But let's just pretend that it's in fact a $100 bill rate, and the agency is still giving us the $100, but now it's only $95. If you're looking at a $95 bill rate after their fee, and the agency only has a 20% margin, they're playing around with $76 instead of $70. Did you hear that? So a big company with a 30% margin oftentimes still couldn't and still can't pay as well as a subcontracted company, provided they're still being offered the real bill rate of, in this case, $100 at a 20% margin. It's $6 more an hour to you guys on a weekly basis. And last time I checked, we're talking about $216 more a week gross, which means I've had this happen. Sometimes a company like the one I run is able to actually pay higher through an MSP, then they can pay their own people directly because their margins are so darn high, if that makes sense. $216 a week times, let's see, 13 weeks. That's $28.08 times 4 assignments. We're talking about $11,000 a year more. So believe it or not, I've had times, and this is the truth case, where in this example, if someone was working with me, and I'm just using a 20% margin, and we're below that actually now, we're at 18. So if someone was working with me at a 20% margin, subcontract them, they would make over $11,000 more a year gross working alongside somebody that has a direct contract with a big company. Is that nuts? But that's how little ripples can create big differences. That's why I always tell you, if you see a $50 an hour, a $50 a week difference, and you say, well, that's not a big deal. You know, that's not a lot of money. It's $2,600 a year. I mean, $50 a week, you know, it is $2,600 a year. If you divide that by 12 months, we're talking about $216 a month. That's a decent car payment. I don't know about anymore. The interest rates are so high. But we're not talking about chump change. Even a small difference like that. That's why I'm telling you guys, when a company is throwing out their rates to you guys and you look at what the gross difference is, little differences multiplied out are huge differences if you really spend the time to do the math. So don't ixnay a company by saying, well, it's only $75, it's only $100 less a week, you know, and it's only gross, right? It's a lot of money. It can be significant amounts of money. We can talk about $4,000 a year literally by the company that you choose, and obviously up to 11, 12, 15 back in the COVID days, we talk about 20 grand a year just by the company that you choose. It's insane how much these numbers can really change and move around if you will spend the time to actually try to, you know, do the math on those. And I urge you to. Okay, so let's kind of get going here a little bit more on this. So it's really fascinating to me that, you know, all these different advancements in vendors has oftentimes, you know, pulled you back as well. Here's one of the areas I think it has pulled back, and I did agree that the efficiency of vendors, a lot of stuff is very, very positive, and much to my chagrin, I didn't think I really would be. One of the areas that I'll defend that I think is not a positive is when it comes to credentialing. I believe wholeheartedly that the majority of vendors have actually stifled and hurt the credentialing process. It's tough enough as it is. When you've got somebody that you're having to report to and having another party look at and approve credentialing, and then goes to the facility for final approval, it adds another step. And oftentimes, I'm just going to throw it out there, a lot of these guys and girls don't know what they're doing. Unfortunately, some vendors have put people in positions of credentialing that are, not all of them, but I'm telling you, I've run across who are like, what is this person doing credentialing? They don't understand, they don't even know what they're talking about, and they're actually hurting this traveler's ability to actually get started. You guys have experienced that before. You know, you put in a quantiferin, and they're saying, well, I have to have a TB, or weird stuff that doesn't make any sense, that has caused delays in your ability to get started. I'll put it this way: my biggest gripe with vendors and credentialing is oftentimes they are so, you know, uncommunicative with us about where we are. We will upload documents for a traveler, and it's days, if not weeks sometimes, until we get feedback on whether or not that's been accepted or approved. And sometimes when it's not approved, we're like, well, why? You had it for 2 weeks. You had it for 10 days. It's very frustrating for us, and it gets very frustrating for you guys. And understand that I think if it was not for that other party in the middle that's just, you know, not even telling us whether or not it's approved or not, things would go quicker. So I'll stand by my statement that I think overwhelmingly credentialing is an area that I think having a vendor involved has hurt the industry. It's hurt you guys. It's hurt the hospitals. It's hurt everybody. I understand why. I mean, they're the ones that are, you know, signing off that this stuff is being done. That's part of the service they're providing for both the, you know, the agency and the hospital. But unfortunately, I think sometimes they've got the wrong person in the wrong position. I'll put it that way. If they had somebody really good, and by the way, I've got vendors that kill it in this department. Absolutely awesome. It's kind of hit or miss, and we know which ones have good credentialing people, and we know which ones have bad credentialing people. And we're like, oh man, if you got a traveler who is not great and not who procrastinates, and you've got that coupled with a vendor who typically has people that don't communicate well, you know you're in trouble. You know you're in trouble with that 2 week or 3 week out deadline of getting that person credentialed. It's almost like never going to happen, and it's frustrating because everybody wants it to happen, but you know. Some people just don't have as much of a skin in the game, so to speak. So it is interesting. Here's what I will say: all agents, all vendors. I keep doing that. All this whole episode. All vendors have a hierarchy. I want to let you guys know this. Sometimes you'll say, well, do you have XYZ system? Yes, we do. We have that. Well, how come I'm not seeing jobs in this particular city? It's because that agency hasn't had all the floodgates and all the doors open to them. There are certain times when some vendors will give you everything, and then sometimes when things are thinner, they'll pull it back and only give it to those big companies, or those companies that are on the highest level tier, because they want to make sure that they're keeping them fed, so to speak. And they don't want everyone to compete because it makes it difficult. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but they are trying to, I guess, tier it. They have their own way of looking at it, so it works for them. But understand that just because you have a system and because you have a vendor doesn't mean you're going to be able to see everything that they've got. And one of them comes to mind where it's just notoriously up and down, and it just depends on the time of year. The thinner things are, the more it really squeezes down. I've seen times where we're at 25% of what we have been before, or we're at 125% of what we typically see, because they're really hurting for certain things. So know that that's kind of a thing. The one thing that I've been asked a lot lately, for those of you that are looking to start your own agency, which again, hopefully we're going to talk more about as we get into, I get back to Denver, we start looking at some things, is these are not easy to be awarded to. Like I said a few minutes ago, I was lucky that people knew who I was. I surround myself with people that have been in the industry for quite a while. They know who they are. We've gotten and we've been awarded contracts because of who we are and on our merit. If you're just starting out and they don't know who you are and you don't have a connection, it's really, really difficult to prove yourself. It's a lot of begging. Come on, just give me something. And then it's a lot of going out and recruiting for jobs that and again, this is where the recruiting model really helps those vendors, is that you're recruiting for for places that you normally won't recruit for after this, because you just want the darn contract. So it makes it kind of difficult. But I get this question asked a lot from new companies that reach out to me and say, well, how do you get all these vendors? And the answer is tenacity. You just have to go out there and just keep going, because they don't award them to everybody. It is really difficult. If an agency is not producing for a certain vendor, they will pull that contract, and they will say, you haven't produced anybody for a while, we're not going to work with you anymore, and they're going to give it to other people. I wish they'd do that more, but they don't. I wish they would keep those floodgates opening. I think should have a few months to start showing you can deliver, and if you can't, then let somebody else have a chance. It'd be pretty good. I think that's just the way it goes. So I already talked about how the money flows and how things work, so I wrote that down here, but I'm not going to. I've already kind of pulled that out. And one of the things I will say is that when it comes to another, I think, negative from a vendor standpoint, is when it comes to timekeeping systems. This is where I think we really all struggle, because, again, it's all predicated on the fact that we are not able and allowed to talk directly to a facility. So lately, I guess since the first of the year, we've had a lot of issues with and I'm thinking of one system that uses Kronos a lot. Just travelers not even in there. Somebody's all of a sudden they're just not there. They work 3 shifts and who knows what, or they forgot to punch in and punch out. I've just had hospitals that are really struggling with their Kronos system. And because we're not able to call directly into that unit and say, hey, manager, I've got this traveler here who worked these 3 shifts. Can you verify? We have to put in for like a request for a change or for approval for all these shifts. It's really difficult because there's a vendor involved and they've got a process, or they just won't pay. And I'll get a report. One vendor's terrible. They're the worst there is out there. You upload your timesheet to them, and they basically, after the payroll's already been going out, and on a Friday I get, hey, here's what your traveler worked this week. Gee, thanks. I see we pay the traveler for the 3 shifts that we uploaded the timesheet for. You've only guaranteed, I guess, validated 2 shifts. So now you're going to pay us on 24, but the traveler's been paid 36, and now we're stuck in that awkward position that we're going to have to go out and pull money back from the traveler until this somehow gets approved. It's a nightmare. It's a mess. And it didn't used to exist when vendors weren't involved. I mean, if you have a great timekeeping system, it should run smoothly. But for those vendors that don't, it's a nightmare. So understand that sometimes when you're upset with your agency, we did an episode early on about payroll errors, and realize that when you're upset with your company, sometimes it's not them. And I've been dealing with just an amazing amount of Kronos issues so far this year that have just been a nightmare, and all from pretty much one vendor. So I've been on them about, we got to figure this out because this is unfair. We're unlike most companies. I pay, and then I fight for the time, which is probably dumb, but I do that because travelers are important to me. I mean, you guys, it's not your responsibility, but I do expect my vendors to pay me properly when we show, authentic and legitimate and validated time. I expect that we ought to be paid as we're paying the traveler every week. It shouldn't even be up for discussion. It drives me nuts when it is, because it's a problem with us, because it can become big numbers really, really quickly, as you guys can imagine. So the communication, I guess what I'm getting at, and fixing problems has become diluted because of the nature of this other party that's oftentimes involved, because we aren't allowed to communicate directly with them. So it's a lot of everything. The communication for interviews, the communication to feedback, it does get convoluted. However, the efficiency and the effectiveness of communicating from a hospital standpoint, take you guys out of the equation, take yourself out of the equation for a moment. Realize that you are sometimes just a number. You guys are. We all are. I'm a number when it comes to agency, so don't be offended by that. I'm saying when it comes to a hospital, they're looking at money, getting patient care so that Fanny can be in that bed, and what they're looking for, and they're looking at you as if you're a number. How many ICU resumes and profiles do we need to look at till we find and consistently have the needs that we have when we want the traveler, when we can't, we've exhausted all our other employment options. So that's what they're looking for. So the vendor system has dramatically improved the volume of fulfillment, if you will, if I'm saying that right, for those vendors. And at the end of the day, as I've always said, hospitals are the ones that pay these bills. So they're the ones that are experiencing the pain. You guys and us, we don't matter. It's, are we getting the bodies met? And I do believe vendors have absolutely fulfilled that void and made that way more efficient than what it used to be. So hats off to them. It definitely works. But I guess, for lack of a better word, the communication part is really where it's struggled. I don't care if we're talking about hiring, we're talking about timekeeping, we're talking about terminations. A vendor just doesn't care. They're going to replace you with somebody else. They're going to have a couple weeks where they're not going to get that 5%, but in a couple weeks they're going to get it from a different company, and it doesn't matter to them what the traveler was. I mean, I'm sure they have hearts, but at the end of the day, it's about getting those bills paid. So they're bummed out that they're not going to have any invoicing happening for a couple of weeks until somebody new comes along. But unfortunately, they're not interested in helping us figure out why someone was terminated, or what can be done, or if there's anything that can be done to salvage it. They just really aren't. So there you go. Here's what I want to say to wrap this episode, because we've been going for a while. I think I got most of the stuff in that I want to talk about. Do I think vendors are here to stay? I don't. Not for the long term. I think what we're seeing is advancements in communications that will eliminate the need for a third party to communicate jobs through. I do believe that MSPs will still be a possibility. They'll last longer. I think VMSs are at some point, and I can't predict how long, but the technology is getting to the point where incredibly useful, but if that can be replaced by technology, which it already is, and a hospital can save, either a hospital can save that 5% or an agency can make that 5%, I think you're going to start to see some of those smaller VMSs disappear. We'll see if I'm right on that one. And I can't predict how long. But I answered a tough question, and I'm not saying anything more than that. I just believe that at some point there won't be that wrinkle and that piece of the pie. I think what I'm seeing is travelers are looking for more and more money. Hospitals are unwilling to pay more and more money, because especially what they went through a few years ago. They're looking at ways to save money. And unfortunately, I see a vendor management system right in the way of that. I showed my example, $9 million on 1,000 travelers. Imagine, 100,000 travelers, what we're talking about. An insane amount of money. Let's just say it's 25 or 50,000, travelers. That's a huge amount of money. And your guess is as good as mine. It ebbs and flows, but I did look at one point, I think between allied and nursing, there was right around 50,000 travelers back a number of years ago is what I saw statistically, which means you're talking about, $900 million. If I'm doing that math right, I think I am. Check me on that. If there is 50,000 travelers, $5 an hour, and I'm only talking about 36 hours, not the 40 hours, right? It's a lot. $900 million. That's a ton of money. So can't tell if I'm being cued to go. I think I probably am. Guys, this has been good. Vendors, they're here to stay for a while. I'll say that. I know I just said that. I don't think they're here forever, but I do think they're here for a while. I think the technology's got some advancement and some movement to make before they get there. But if you asked me to answer a question and you truly needed an answer, that was my best guess. I don't think they're here forever. I see things improving, and the smart ones will figure out how to be the catalyst for those improvements instead of being the victim of those improvements. So, it was a lot. Guys, I appreciate it. Good night from sunny Florida. Not anymore, but beautiful Florida. We appreciate you. Catch you next time on Travel Evolved.